The next guest was FDA Commissioner and worked at CMS, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who now serves as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and sits on the board of Pfizer. Welcome, Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Gottlieb is one of my best interviews. He's a very straight shooter. He's been at a number of our events. I do want to start off just getting your perspective. We're coming out of the pandemic. Amazingly, it's been 3 years. I've interviewed about this before. What are your thoughts? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, look, I think we're now entering a stage where this is going to be a more endemic illness. We've always talked about a time when this would become more of a seasonal virus and we would deal with it much like we deal with the flu. I think what surprised public health officials, and surprised me, quite frankly, is it hasn't really settled into a seasonal pattern that you would expect from a normal coronavirus, where you'd expect it to be a late winter pathogen. We seem to have successive waves of infection. There's some people who think that that's going to be the status quo for the foreseeable future. That said, we're probably likely to see the big surges in the late summer and the wintertime like we've seen in past years. You see a late surge in the late summer in the south, and then this does become a bigger nuisance in the wintertime. And I think that's what we're probably going to face this year. You're going to see FDA probably make a recommendation in late June for a reformulated vaccine, and you'll probably see a recommendation that people, particularly those who are at risk of COVID, get a booster in the fall, much like they get a flu vaccine each year, probably on the same schedule. So I think that that's kind of the pattern we're settling into for the foreseeable future, that this will be like a flu type of scenario. That said, we're still seeing far more death and disease from COVID than we typically see from a seasonal flu.
On this CMS FDA dynamic, as I mentioned in your intro, you've worked for both agencies. I've covered both agencies, and we have this. You and I both know it's safe and effective, and then reasonable and necessary. And you have these two different functions, very, very different. But then you have what seemingly is kind of a conflict here. You've written about this issue in op-eds. The Wall Street Journal editorial board has also weighed in on this, pushing CMS. What's going on here, Scott?
Well, look, I think there's nothing inherently wrong with CMS establishing coverage criteria that tries to promote the best use of products and protect patients. And they're also stewards of a budget. They are a public health agency, although I'm not sure they always look at their mandate through the lens of trying to promote public health goals per se. I think a lot of times they get preoccupied more with budget concerns, which is also a secondary consideration they should be making. I think the problem here with the Alzheimer's drugs is that it does feel a lot like a policy outcome in search of a clinical criteria, that they went into this trying to craft a clinical criteria to try to get at the outcome that they wanted, which was to put the brakes on utilization of these products and to slow uptake. And we've seen this before from the agency. I don't mean this in a pejorative way. We've seen this with implantable defibrillators, where they initially set a clinical criteria around the QRS, the interval on EKGs, as the criteria when people wouldn't qualify for implantable defibrillators. Subsequent studies showed that that was wrong, tragically wrong, because it meant a lot of patients who could have benefited and been saved by defibrillators didn't get them. We also saw this with TAVR, the minimally invasive aortic valve replacement, where they set very restrictive criteria because they were worried that with a minimally invasive alternative to open heart surgery, a lot of patients with diseased aortic valves would now be indicated for that procedure and get their valves repaired, and it would create a budget problem for them. So they set criteria where you needed to have two physicians say that you were indicated for it. They only reserved it for people who had severe aortic stenosis. They said that both a cardiologist, so an interventional cardiologist and a cardiothoracic surgeon, had to be in the operating room at the same time, arguing that the procedure went wrong. You wanted the cardiothoracic surgeon on hand, which procedures rarely went wrong. The real reason they did that, as most I think now agree, is they didn't want to see competition erupt between the minimally invasive cardiologists, the cardiologists that do minimally invasive procedures, and the cardiothoracic surgeons, because competition between two medical specialties would have promoted more utilization. So they basically tried to get the two provider groups to cooperate and be in a room at the same time. So these are flawed decisions insofar as they were trying to affect a policy goal by backing into a clinical criteria. And I think they've done the same thing here. They're wrong on the science. I think there's now been multiple studies that have showed that drugs that do affect plaque through the mechanisms that these drugs do have an impact on cognition. It's now not just one drug, but multiple drugs through multiple studies. I think they need to reconsider this and admit that they were early and wrong on the science, and reconsider the original decision that they made.
That plays into an audience question. This is from Daniel Stahl, retired HR professional from Pfizer. As I mentioned, you serve on the Pfizer board. But it was also a question I had on my list. What are the projected timelines for the practical access to the public on new treatments? I mean, when do you think patients could see potentially CMS coming up with a new approach or saying maybe they were wrong? I don't know.
Yeah, look, I from what I've heard, they're not actively reconsidering what they did through the coverage decision that they made, and access is going to be restricted going forward to patients who enter clinical trials, post-market clinical trials, which in and of itself is coercive because it's going to force patients to have to go through certain conditions, go to certain centers, submit to certain data collection in order to get access to a treatment that in some cases could be life extending for them or life-saving. So that's not something that an IRB would be comfortable with, and yet it's the situation that we're setting up here, that patients are going to have to be forced into certain conditions and certain scenarios in order to get access to a drug that I think most senior citizens probably had a reasonable expectation that they would have been able to get access to if such a drug became available when they paid into Medicare all those years. So I think this is unfortunate, and the agency should reconsider it. The final point I would make about this, though, is that I said at the outset, there's nothing inherently wrong with CMS trying to make sure patients are protected, that they're getting good value for the taxpayer. They need to have an objective process for doing that. The process that they went through with all these decisions, TAVR, the implantable defibrillators, and this decision certainly was very ad hoc. And I think if Congress did a really thorough review, you had the GAO come in, you'd see that it was a process led by a handful of individuals with strong opinions, without a lot of the kind of rigor that you would expect, for example, from FDA. Where FDA has a very objective process with a lot of review and open advisory committees, expert independent advisory committees overseeing what the agency does.
You know that there are many people at CMS and FDA who are very smart, very talented, and they're doing the public's work. But you mentioned the ad hoc element. I mean, do you think that there should be process changes? I mean, can FDA and CMS keep up with the latest treatments? And obviously the government has to review these things. We saw that during COVID-19. But do you think there should be some tweaks in how either agency operates?
Look, I have confidence in FDA. I think with CMS on the Part D side, so the small molecule side, those decisions are largely left to health plans who do have expertise to make decisions around coverage rules. And you see them making decisions every day around coverage that partly incorporates considerations of outcomes and safety and clinical criteria, and partly incorporates decisions around or considerations around budget and cost. I think what's unique is on the Part B side, where CMS is largely a price taker. They don't have the ability to negotiate price, so they're going to have it under the IRA, although I don't think that they feel that will kick in soon enough with some of these high-cost products, where they've long felt that they were largely a price taker. They've tried to control spending through putting restrictions on utilization. And that's how they've started to use coverage with evidence development. That's how they've started to use these kinds of coverage decisions like you've seen with TAVR, with the implantable defibrillators, and now with the Alzheimer's drugs. When these drugs come along or these products come along where they think that the Medicare population is going to be widely indicated for them, so you'll get wide utilization and there's a high price tag associated with it, that's where they tend to create these contrived processes to apply coverage rules to limit or slow utilization. Today with implantable defibrillators, they're widely accessible, but they over a course of a decade dramatically slowed the utilization, so it wasn't a one-time budget shock. And I think that is part of the intended purpose, whether it's stated or not stated very clearly by the agency. So my argument would be get them out of making these decisions on Part B drugs. I think they should be competitively bid. We should move it into a scheme like Part D. There's been a lot of resistance to that over the years. So if you're going to have CMS in the driver's seat making coverage rules around these products based in part, if not in large part, on budget considerations, they need to have a very rigorous process with advisory committees that have expertise in these areas, people on staff with the expertise to review clinical information. They don't have that right now. They have when I wrote an op-ed on this about a year ago, they had about 8 doctors in the coverage group. They didn't have people who are expert in this particular space. FDA, by contrast, when you look at the review divisions, they have dozens of people with deep expertise in these areas, and they build expertise over time at the agency, and then they have their advisory committees.
Last question, and we're running out of time. I know this is a tough one to answer quickly, but thinking long term, other than CMS and FDA decisions this year, what do policymakers need to do to attack Alzheimer's?
Look, I think we're seeing an unprecedented amount of innovation, but you're also seeing companies pull away from this particular field because of some of the challenges of getting drugs developed and approved, particularly and covered, particularly drugs that would slow progression. You want to be able to diagnose patients early before they have objective declines in their cognition and they're showing decline on a median mental status test, because by that point they've had a lot of damage and lost a lot of cognition that they're probably not going to regain. So you need tools to diagnose patients early and ways to get drugs approved. That's what the agency has done, FDA has done through the guidance that they put out back in 2019 by allowing drugs to be approved through accelerated approval for Alzheimer's if they could show an impact on a surrogate measure like plaque formation. Perhaps imaging is going to be a surrogate measure that gets used in the near future. Final point I'll make, and I'll do this quickly, is that the IRA really biases drug development away from small molecule drug development towards biologics because of the way the price controls set in, 9 years for small molecules at 13 years for biologics. And a lot of brain diseases, particularly mental health diseases, are probably going to be more addressable through small molecules because small molecules have the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier and affect neurotransmitters in the brain, affect pathways in the brain in ways that biologics won't be able to. And I do worry that you're going to see a lot of companies get out of not just small molecules, but particularly small molecules in the mental health space in particular.
Scott Gottlieb, thank you so much for joining us. I always learn something when I talk with you.
Thanks a lot.